If you've never been to one of our presentations before, just give you a quick little short synopsis of who Storm Surge is. So we're a local nonprofit group, and we formed about 3 years ago. And our purpose is basically to raise awareness to climate change and sea level rise issues and motivate our local communities to take the appropriate steps and actions to make us more resilient and also maybe mitigate some of the causes of climate change and sea level rise. We're also expanding our focus from where we were 3 years ago. 3 years ago, we were primarily focused on coastal issues, and now we're taking it up a notch. We're focusing a bit more on climate issues, so we're going to be bringing in more programs in regards to that. And we're going to be working with local municipalities on actually coming up with ideas to reduce the carbon footprint through the lives that we lead. And as part of that, we're going to be launching a new website for the organization, which will probably happen in the next 3 to 4 weeks, maybe a little bit sooner. And so we're hoping that you may be signed in with your email address, and we'll send you that link when that website is up. And the other purpose for getting your email address is so that we can alert you to other programs. Our next program in the pipeline is coming up during the Earth Week on April 23rd, and it's going to be held at the Parker River National Wildlife Refuge in the auditorium there. And the 26th, sorry. Anyway, same time, 7 o'clock at the refuge. And the speaker is going to be George Buckley. He's the Assistant Director of Sustainability from Harvard University. And he's going to be speaking on ocean acidification and the effect on ecosystems and the fisheries and that sort of thing. Also, since we're a nonprofit group, we want to thank our sponsors. The Institution for Savings has been sponsoring us from the beginning, along with the New England Grassroots Fund. But we also happily accept $1 or $2 donations, whatever you can afford. If you like this program, there's a donation jar at the sign-in desk. And the last bit of housekeeping is that the restrooms are in that corner there. Women's room on the left, men's room on the right. Okay, so leading into tonight's presentation. So I think as a coastal community, we're fairly well aware that sea level's been rising. And if you look at the numbers since 1880, it's risen about 8 inches. But what's a little bit more alarming is that 6 of those inches have come since 1963. And the funny thing with sea level rise is that it's an uneven line. It's not very linear. It sort of pulsates. For example, back in 2009, there was a sudden spike in sea level rise during that year of 9 inches. And that happened because of a slowdown in the Gulf Stream, which was related to climate change. It has to do a lot with the currents in the ocean and what's going on in Antarctica. But the point is that we can get these sudden rises and falls in sea level rise. But in general, it's been trending upwards. And the other thing that's going on is that the climate is in fact changing. Back in the 80s, we all remember the Star Wars program that President Reagan advocated, and also satellites went up there. Well, they were not just military satellites, they're also collecting a lot of data relative to our planet. And these instruments that we have up in the sky and in various observatories are showing that greenhouse gases are accumulating in the atmosphere, and that CO2 is routinely at 400 parts per million and more. And it used to be thought that 300 was a safe level, but we've certainly surpassed that. And then all these instruments that are gathering data are also showing that the oceans are warming, as well as is the atmosphere. And what the bottom line is with all this is that our weather is being affected. And if you look at billion-dollar annual weather events, they've doubled since 1980. So we used to have 5 of those a year back in 1980, and now we're averaging 11, with some years as many as 14. I don't know if you notice on the news, but the tornado season is year-round now. It used to be primarily a spring-summer event. Now it just goes all year round. And every day on the national news, you've got a meteorologist talking about severe weather. So while the rest of the world sees that climate change is a problem, the current policy at the federal level is to turn a blind eye to it yet. And I find this personally troubling because scientists who are in the know and really study this are really very concerned. And we had a presenter here from MIT a little over a year ago, and he told me off the record he really feels that we're in the 11th hour of this problem in terms of we really hope to affect a change. And, you know, globally, we're really not tackling it very well at this point. And Excuse me, sorry. So it's sort of, based on our actions, it's like we took our foot off the brake pedal recently and put it back on the accelerator. We're getting back into fossil fuels, stripping some of the regulations from the EPA and rolling back the climate action plan, and it's not really a direction I think we should be going in. Because it's going to put us back in that high emissions curve scenario, which is going to ramp up sea level rise and all the other changes that come along with climate change. And the question is really, when we approach this tipping point, when is it really going to get away from us? Now, the current disposition of the federal government is to shift some of the funding from various social and environmental programs over to military spending and infrastructure, which is all well and good, but in the end, we're still adding to a deficit that we're running in this country, and it's going to be difficult to fund all of these programs. And where this is going to come to a head is also our behavior of subsidizing coastal development through the federal flood insurance program. Taxpayers in the Midwest who have never seen the ocean before are paying for insurance policies on homes and beaches that they will never see or maybe can't ever see because there is no access. And the only reason those hotels or whatever infrastructure is being built there is because the flood insurance is cheap enough in order to do it. The other thing that incentivizes the coastal development is also some of the big federally funded coastal projects in terms of erosion control and beach nourishment and that sort of thing. And we up here in New England actually haven't benefited as much as Rob will show as some of the other states in the country. But anyway, this is all going to come to a head monetarily at some point, and Rob's going to speak tonight about our national sea level rise policy and what that may be, and although it might not be stated, we sort of, I guess, have one if you base it on what our actions are. So anyway, I wanted to introduce Dr. Robert Young. He's a protege of Orrin Pilkey. If you know that name, he's the sort of grandfather of coastal geology. And Rob's also the director of the program for the study of developed shorelines, and I'll let him speak a little bit more to that. But it's a Duke University, Western Carolina joint venture. And Rob's done a lot of work worldwide, internationally, in this regard. And he's been on NPR, CNN, and he was in the film Shored Up, which we screened here a few years back. And he's been quoted in the New York Times and most recently last fall in Boston Magazine. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce Rob Young. There you go.
Good evening, everybody.
It was so nice to
have a chance to leave the 75-degree weather in the mountains of North Carolina today to come up here to the balmy Northeast. I see you still have the piles of dirty snow around. I do miss a little bit of New England weather. I got a master's degree at the University of Maine in Orono. Spent a few years up there. We have some alums in the crowd? No? Yes? And I taught at the University of Vermont for a few years before, I finally couldn't stand living without dogwood trees and azaleas. But I do miss New England in January and February. March, April, not so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate having such a nice big crowd this evening. I'm going to talk about a couple of things from a very big picture view. So my presentation is not going to focus too much on local matters other than the themes. But there will be some time for questions afterwards. I'm going to talk a little bit today about climate change and how I think that we're failing to communicate well about it and understand it as a nation, not from a political perspective. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about national coastal policy, the fact that we don't really have one, and why that's a problem. So first, let me do a little commercial for the program for the study of developed shorelines. You're welcome to follow us on Facebook, by the way. If you're interested in tonight's presentation, you can give money to us too. The center that I direct was founded at Duke University in the mid-'80s. It's now a joint program, primarily because I didn't want to leave my home in western North Carolina and move to Durham, North Carolina. So most activities now are in the mountains of North Carolina. Western Carolina University. Anybody ever been to Silva, Cullowhee, North Carolina? 1, 2. We're about 50 minutes to the west of Asheville, North Carolina, near Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Sort of 30 minutes from South Carolina, 30 minutes from Georgia, 30 minutes from Tennessee. God's country. The center that I direct is unusual in that we do both science and policy under the same roof. I have people who work for me who are sort of policy wonks. I have people who work for me who are scientists. We get National Science Foundation grants to study coastal processes, but we also spend a lot of time trying to communicate that science to decision makers at all levels, from community level to the federal government. We have a lot of different partners and projects, from the National Park Service to individual companies like Patagonia, do a lot of work with the Surfrider Foundation, and a lot of local communities. We do externally funded applied research and research projects. We develop data products, some of which I'll be showing you a little bit of today. We provide quite a bit of service in a wide variety of ways to government, but also to international NGOs and sometimes individual property owners. We do local, one parcel at a time, vulnerability assessments for people who are interested in that kind of thing. The most exciting thing that we have going on at the moment is that we have developed the tool that the National Park Service is using to assess the vulnerability of every single asset and every single coastal park in the United States of America. So that's everything from the Statue of Liberty to Cape Cod to an outhouse in the Everglades, cultural resources in Sitka in Alaska. We developed the tool for assessing the vulnerability of every single piece of infrastructure the Park Service has, and now we're deploying the tool, one park at a time. It's a terrible job. We often have to visit these parks. Yes, it's quite an honor to be doing that, and it allows us to help the National Park Service develop adaptation plans to coastal hazards and sea level rise for their assets, like the poster child for coastal adaptation, moving the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse off of the coast, almost a half a mile inland. We also work on coastal restoration projects. This is my favorite. We've been working for 10 years on the Elwha River restoration out in Olympic National Park on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington, largest dam removal in U.S. history. Both of those dams that you see there were pulled down, and 2 large reservoirs drained to restore salmon to the river. Our part of the project, since I'm a coastal geologist, is to understand what happens when all that sediment that you see in the reservoir there makes its way back out to the coast to rebuild the Elwha River Delta. So this is one of our more applied research projects, is understanding what happens when you shut off the sediment flow for 100 years and then turn it back on. This project has been a great success. There used to be 500,000 salmon swimming up this river. The stocks went down to about 3,000, and as of last year they had a run of over 20,000, and the fish are coming back, which is very exciting. We also do quite a bit of research on beach nourishment. This is when you pump sand onto the beach to rebuild the beach. We are funded by the United States Geological Survey to map and track every beach nourishment project that's ever happened in the United States of America. And we have an online database where you can actually look up these projects if for some reason you're interested. It has volumes, costs, and that kind of thing. And I'm going to talk a lot more about beach nourishment in a little bit. We also track global sand mining. I was in Nairobi, Kenya, working with the United Nations in November, trying to document the degree to which illegal sand mining internationally is impacting beaches in the nearshore zone. Sand mining has become a huge problem, and because beach sand is an easy source of construction aggregate in the developing world. We move sand here to build beaches. In the developing world, they move sand to build buildings. And tracking these are the kinds of databases that we maintain that really nobody else is bothering to pay attention to. Morocco, for example, has removed about 27 linear miles of their beach sand, stripped it down to bedrock, so that they can build hotels for people who want to come to the beach in Morocco. There's irony there. We maintain an image database. We do post-storm reconnaissance after almost every major event in the U.S. East Coast, Gulf Coast, and the Caribbean. And we distribute these images freely to media, NGOs, and a variety of other organizations using this stuff. So that's a little bit about what we do. There's a lot more. I could talk all night, and I love to, but no. So let's talk a little bit about why I'm here. And I'm here to talk about coastal management, and I'm here to talk a little bit about why climate change is making coastal management a little bit more difficult. And I talk about climate change quite a bit. And lately I've been enjoying talking about climate change, because it's something that scientists typically don't do very well. And it's something that environmentalists typically don't do very well. And when I say we don't do it very well, I mean that we're not communicating the importance of these things very well beyond people who are like us. Well, here's the good news. Survey data from George Mason and Yale's survey on information about climate change. So the good news is that if you go ask the general public who they trust to give them information about climate change, slightly less than 80% of people still believe scientists are trustworthy to give them information about climate change. So we're still beating the news media and religious leaders and Schwarzenegger and Sarah Palin, so that's the good news. This is the bad news, is that most people in the United States of America can't actually name a living scientist. And the people that they can name are certainly not climate scientists. So we have an identity problem. Most folks, especially those who are in rural America, working class America, don't know any scientists, or at least people who would self-identify as a scientist. They can't put a face on science or scientists. The scientists are sort of other to them. This is who they picture, when they're picturing a scientist. They don't really know science or scientists. And we have not done a very good job of introducing ourselves to them. When you don't know someone, it's easy for that person to be demonized. So because there's this divide between scientists and many of the citizens of the United States, we have had this little cottage industry pop up of not just sort of questioning the science, but questioning the scientists themselves. So I'll call these friendly folks sort of the professional skeptics or the professional obfuscators. This is a big problem in our communication right now. We have a group of folks who live in America that don't really know any scientists, but then we have a very small group of people who don't like the idea of climate change or what you'd have to do to solve it, and rather than just deciding that that's a policy question, they've decided to attack the science and the scientists, right? So these are the skeptics. I don't believe we've met. I don't believe you don't believe we've met. A meeting of skeptics must be a lot of fun. I also collect climate change cartoons, by the way. The problem is that many scientists and environmentalists attribute the same motives that the skeptics have, the professional skeptics, the political skeptics, the blogosphere. They attribute the same motives that those folks have to all the rest of our citizens who are confused about climate change, because they've become confused by this small group of obfuscators. And that's a problem. So it's easy for those folks to believe. I really like the cartoons that the skeptics themselves come up with. You see, so the scientist who doesn't believe that humans cause global warming is on the rack, while the other scientist is saying, okay, he believes mankind causes climate change, so now we can give him back his research funds, all right? Because we're all in it for the grant money is one of the myths that the skeptics would like you to believe. Let me assure you that scientists do not make a name for themselves by just agreeing with what everyone else before them has said. In fact, the most famous scientist on the planet would be the one that would conclusively show that carbon dioxide is playing no role in global warming. You don't make a name for yourself as a scientist by simply standing in line and not ever discovering anything new. Nor do scientists get together in some sort of undisclosed location once a year to try and figure out how we can ruin the global economy. We're not that organized, trust me. This idea of some sort of grand scientific collusion amongst 5,000 competing universities with 40,000 competing researchers is just not plausible. But there's a cottage industry out there that likes to spread that kind of misinformation and doubt. And it works because there's a big segment of America that doesn't really know us and hasn't heard anything from us directly, really. So we do have a communication problem. And the communication problem is made worse when you have to deliver bad news, right? Our extended forecast includes global warming and the catastrophic end of the human race. But for the weekend, it's looking like sunny skies. You know, bad news is hard to deliver, especially if you're in a country that 10 years ago was coming off of a recession, or if you're in a rural community that's dealing with opioid addiction and loss of decent minimum wage jobs. Who wants to hear the bad news? It's difficult to deliver that kind of a message, and I think we have to understand that. The other thing we have to understand as scientists, when we're trying to communicate a message of why climate change matters to people, is that we all don't have the same environmental ethic or ethos. We don't have the same ethics about everything. Take, for example, my father-in-law, Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl's from Eastern North Carolina. Do not put Mr. Carl's name in the newspaper if you're writing a piece about this presentation tonight. Mr. Carl is on the internet. You may not put Mr. Carl's name in the paper. You know, Mr. Carl is from Eastern North Carolina. The family farms soybeans, corn. My brother-in-law is the fire chief of the Fort Barnwell Volunteer Fire Department, population about 116. Mr. Carl does not care about polar bears. I'm sorry. Mr. Carl does not care that polar bears may not be able to float out on ice and hunt for seals in 10 years. It would be a luxury for him to care about that. I do like this cartoon, though. The bad news is the ice cap is melting and it's going to be almost impossible to catch seals. The good news is if we keep moving south, there's tons of fat animals called humans who can't run very fast. We have to be able to meet people where they are when we're talking about climate change. And you can't walk into many communities in the United States of America and start by talking about polar bears. We need to talk about the fact that in Eastern North Carolina, because sea level is rising and the groundwater table is coming up, they're probably not going to be planting tobacco there 20 or 30 years from now. They're already planting 4 weeks later than they used to. Tobacco doesn't like to be wet. We need to make it real for people in the place that they live. And there is still this general distrust out there. Remember the ozone problem, right? It's ironic that it both works for us and against us. There are a lot of people who think that we are alarmist. And quite frankly, I have a lot of colleagues who talk about climate change as if they were alarmists. And but the other thing about ozone, have you heard a lot about the ozone problem lately? Because we solved it, largely through global action. On the other hand, this is how scientists view the problem, right? Seems especially relevant today. This cartoon's like 3 years old, but could have been drawn last week. Scientists are becoming increasingly frustrated by this political world that they're not accustomed to living in, trying to understand how to interact within it. So much so that many scientists want to do this now. This is the poster for the DC March for Science. You'll see that it has everything in it. Nothing represents scientists more than a raised fist. I mean, come on. And I don't know why the space shuttle has a rainbow behind it. On January 31st, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that said that I thought the March for Science was a bad idea. I'm not going to go into the details of that right now. Google it if you're interested when you get home. Part of why I don't think that it's a good idea is exemplified by this particular poster right here. Scientists have a communication problem. I spend a lot of time going into Ruritan, Rotary, Kiwanis, and local groups like that to talk about climate change and sea level rise to regular folks. It's something that I like to do. And this is how I always try and start. First, I want to convince people that climate change is a problem. I don't like to start with nightmare scenarios, and I don't even really like to talk too much, if I don't have to, about reducing our fossil fuel consumption at the beginning of a talk. I'll answer questions about that. But first, everybody in America needs to understand that the planet's getting warmer and things are changing. And the changes are unidirectional. And so I'm going to say something that you may think is odd. I'm going to suggest to you that the worst way to explain global warming to people is by talking about temperature. If the primary thing you're doing to convince people that the planet is getting warmer is to show them temperature graphs, you are going to just spend all of your time arguing about cold winters and about the temperature data itself, which is very popular in Washington, is to argue about the temperature data. I mean, look at this graph to begin with. So the changes that we're asking people to be afraid of are on the order of tenths of a degree centigrade on the y-axis, right? That doesn't sound a lot to most regular folks. I actually, usually, if I go to the Kiwanis or the Rotary or something, I actually have that in Fahrenheit on the y-axis, because I don't want them to think I'm a communist. I left centigrade for you guys. I'm not sure what that says about my expectations of folks here in Newburyport. You know, it's difficult just to talk to people about temperature because people don't understand the difference between weather and climate in general. You know, weather is what's going to happen 2 days from now. Climate is what's going to happen 5 years from now. These are important differences. If you talk primarily to people about global warming, just talking about, oh, it was the hottest day we've had in a long time last week, then you get cartoons like this, where the global warming protesters are having to burn their stop global warming signs because it was so, this was in Atlanta when we had a really, really cold winter 3 years ago. So this was what was in the Atlanta paper. And then, then you look at these temperature anomalies for the U.S. and see that big cold area sitting right over the U.S. You know, there are parts of our country that have actually been experiencing colder than normal weather, and even though, look at the Arctic is baking, it's hard for people to, when you just say we had the warmest January in history in 2013. I mean, it's hard for people to grasp that. We need to explain to folks that I don't need to look at any temperature data to tell you that the planet's getting warmer. I'm not even sure where you would stick the thermometer to take the temperature of the Earth anyway. And you know, what matters most for temperature change? Northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, nighttime, daytime, summer temperatures, winter temperatures? I'm not even sure that we really know what temperature data is the most important for changing our planet. What I can tell you is that the Earth gives us that message, and the Earth averages out those temperatures for us without having to look at any temperature data. Muir and Riggs Glacier in Alaska. Peterson Glacier. Do it again. I could show you 100 of these. If you look at alpine ice, alpine glaciers, not Antarctica or Greenland, every single alpine glacier, with only a few exceptions where precipitation has been increasing, on every continent, both hemispheres, it's getting smaller. Why? Because the planet's getting warmer. Alpine ice is receding. I don't need to look at any temperature data for that. They're getting smaller because the planet's getting warmer. We see the same thing in Greenland with the Greenland ice sheet. Ice mass, we can measure the entire mass of the ice sheet now. Ice mass is decreasing. If you look at sea ice, in the Antarctic in particular, we hit another low this last winter, but the total sea ice in the Arctic has been declining for a long time. There are a lot of people paying attention to this right now. There was an interesting show on 1A on National Public Radio yesterday, the day before. That's the show that took over for Diane Rehm, for those of you who might be public radio junkies. Well worth going back and listening to. The geopolitical implications for the changes of Arctic sea ice are tremendous. The Russians have planted a titanium pole at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean at the North Pole, claiming it. Do you know that? I don't know if they colluded with the Trump campaign when they did. Oh, sorry. That was before the election, though. Everybody's talking about the Northwest Passage. Cruise ships went through the Northwest Passage last summer. Global warming. You don't need to look at temperature data. The predicted decline in Arctic sea ice. Think of the implications for the loss of Arctic sea ice. Where is Santa's workshop going to be? I mean, these are serious issues. Same thing in Antarctica, although it's not quite as simple in Antarctica as it is in other places. It's a little bit more complicated back down there. Permafrost thawing. The Canadians have been tracking permafrost in northern Canada for a long time. Permafrost matters. If you live up north, there are cities and roads built on it. If it melts, that's bad. And it has been melting at alarming rates. Yeah, that one's bad, I know. And then finally, sea level rise, which is an important part of my job. Sea level rises because the volume of water in the oceans is increasing. You can increase the volume of water in the ocean two ways. You can add water, or you can warm the water so that it expands. Global warming does both. It melts land-based ice and adds water into the ocean, and it warms the upper layers of the ocean so that it expands. So you put all of these lines of evidence together: retreat of glacial ice and alpine glaciers, permafrost thawing, rising sea level, which we've been measuring directly for 100 years. There is absolutely no question that the planet is getting warmer. No question. You can't argue about it. And you don't need to look at a temperature graph to understand that. So that's an important point. The other aspect of global climate change that's important is rising sea level. One of the reasons why many of you are probably here today. Rising sea level is also not something that we can debate. We have been measuring the rise of the oceans for more than 100 years all over the planet. And we didn't even know that we were doing it for most of that period of time. Fortunately, the English Navy in particular installed tide gauges in both hemispheres all over the planet. And while those tide gauges may do this every day, for those that have been around for 100 years, they've done this over time. You put all that tide gauge data together from across the planet, and you can actually watch sea level rise through time. And the rate at which that has happened has increased through time. So there is no question that sea level is rising. And there's no question that it is rising because the planet is warming. There's also no question that at the end of the 19th century, the rate of rise was slower than it is right now. Today, rather than tide gauges, we're measuring sea level rise directly from satellite altimetry. So satellites are taking millions of measurements of ocean level every day. And we see a global rate of sea level rise that's around 3.1, 3.2 millimeters a year. Now that may not sound like a lot right now, but in some places it's plenty. So if we're talking about sea level rise that might translate to 10 to 15 inches over 100 years, if you're in Bangladesh and the slope of your nearshore zone is like 1 to 100,000, 15 inches of change is a lot. In eastern North Carolina, it's a lot. Miami-Dade County. Any place where the slope is low at the coast, it's plenty. And this is with no acceleration. This is the minimum. This is the minimum. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the vast majority of scientists expect that the rate of sea level rise is going to increase in the future. Most organizations are predicting that we'll have not 10 to 15 inches by the end of the century, but more like 20 to 30, somewhere in there. But I don't even really like to talk about that much. I just like to talk about the stuff we know is going to happen, and that's the straight line projection. Because right now, we're not doing anything about that. So what's the point in talking about having 3 feet of sea level rise when we're not doing a very good job of dealing with even just a little bit of sea level rise? And I'll come back to that in just a second. Just so you know, the amount of sea level rise you have varies depending on where you are, because the land surface can move up and down too. So where we are right now is not nearly as bad as Louisiana, for example, where the rate of sea level rise is 3 times what it is here because the delta is subsiding while the sea is coming up. So that's what we call relative sea level rise. So the threat of sea level rise varies really depending on where you are. But still, sea level rise is not always real to everybody. Especially folks who don't live at the coast. The Speaker of the Senate of North Carolina for 25 years represented a coastal district, and he didn't really like the idea of sea level rise that much. He was worried about what it was going to do to his tax base. And he famously said on the floor of the North Carolina legislature, "I've been driving home to my district for 25 years, and I've never seen the sea level rise." I would have been amazed if he had. We took his staff out in the field a couple months after that. They were nice enough to go along with us, and we showed them the sea level rise. This is what almost every marsh in eastern North Carolina looks like. You may notice that it used to be a forest, and now it's a marsh. That's sea level rise. Marshes marching inland in response to rising sea level. Farm fields in eastern North Carolina don't drain in the spring like they used to. Sea level rise has perched the groundwater table. The water has to evaporate now. It can't go down. And the salinity in our estuaries is moving upriver and threatening water intake for communities. These are real problems resulting from sea level rise that folks understand. Believe me, the people in the Tidewater, Virginia area of all political stripes understand rising sea level. Because 3 years ago, the dry dock for the General Dynamics dry dock that handles our nuclear submarines filled up with water for the first time ever in a storm that was not a big storm. That'll get your attention if you're the Department of Defense. Fortunately for them, there was nothing in it at the time. So, I think we can convince folks that the planet's warming and sea level is rising if we tell better stories and talk about it in a little bit of a different way. But that's only a small part of the battle, because the real battle is figuring out what to do once you agree that you have a little bit of a problem. The new ark, right? It's the cars instead of the animals. So it's not just that we deny that we have coastal hazards and sea level rise in the U.S. and globally, by the way. This is not a uniquely American problem. It's that we are doing exactly the wrong thing given the problem. It's not just the sea level, it's not just the shoreline coming to us. It's that we are also coming to the shore. This is Benidorm, Spain in the 1970s. This is Benidorm, Spain today. This is what you get when a whole bunch of Englishmen and Germans can fly to Spain for $29 on Ryanair. Pretty amazing, huh? You see, our shorelines were meant to be dynamic and to move. An important thing that everybody has to understand is that rising sea level is not a problem for beaches, for marshes, or estuaries, or anything. Rising sea level just moves things. During the last ice age, about 15,000 years ago, which is like yesterday to a geologist, sea level was hundreds of feet lower than it is today. George's Bank was exposed. Our shorelines have moved miles as sea level rose to its present position following the last ice age. The beaches didn't go away. The marshes are still here. It all just moves. They were designed to be dynamic. The problem is that now we want to live on them, on these places that are designed to move. So, what's our national policy for how to deal with these dynamic coastal environments? Well, the President formed a task force after Hurricane Sandy to get on top of this and make sure that we do wise rebuilding or something like that. But the bad news is that most of it was just a lot of talking, and that after Hurricane Sandy, I'm going to go into this in a little bit of detail, we just put everything back where it was. And that we have made, without any national discussion, we've essentially decided that we're just going to hold everything in place where it is forever, as long as we can. The President's task force basically tried to make everybody happy. They didn't decide that we should be doing anything that's difficult. Coordinate with local, federal, state, and ensure the region is rebuilt in a way that makes it more resilient, which can mean anything to anybody. Cut the red tape. They made a lot of changes to get the money in faster after the hurricane. It is hard to get $60 billion in fast. That's how much we spent in the Sandy Relief Act, $60 billion. So what we got from all of that was no change, no new policy. Here's Long Beach Island, New York. Sandy tore the boardwalk up, and $400 million of federal funds came in and put the beach back in front of the boardwalk. Then we built an even better and bigger boardwalk. Now it has utilities under it, and it didn't before. Beautiful, isn't it? At the local level, this is Southampton Village in the Hamptons, Long Island. That's one house. I think you could take all the houses in my county and stuff them inside that house. And after Sandy, the governor gave an emergency order saying property owners can rebuild any existing coastal protection they have. Well, this individual didn't really have any coastal protection, but he claimed he had something buried there. And so this was done under an emergency order after Sandy. These are the town trustees for Southampton who were trying to oppose the project with the state, and they were unsuccessful. You can see how big one of these rocks is. They had to haul them in 2 at a time on a flatbed. This is post-Sandy adaptation in the Hamptons. You can imagine how much it costs just to move those rocks from the quarry that they came from in upstate New York to the coast. I can't even imagine. This is illegal, by the way. Should not have been legal. Anything like that ever happen around here? I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. This is the softer solution, geotextile bags. If you don't have the money for rocks, people did this all over Long Island after Hurricane Sandy. No forethought, no organized plan, no nothing. This was the poster child for Hurricane Sandy. I don't know if you remember the big breach that happened in Maniloking, New Jersey, ripped the island in half. All the reporters went there, did lots of their reporting from there. It's what it looks like now. They put all the houses back, they put a new seawall in there, they filled in the breach. The property values are higher than they were before the storm. This has basically been the response for the $60 billion post-Sandy. We've decided to raise some things up. That's been our adaptation. But we didn't move anything out of the way. We raised some things up because FEMA requires it for you to get property insurance or for a community to get a discount under the community rating system for federal flood insurance. So we did encourage some people to lift some things up. Yeah, we lifted a lot of things up, in fact. Look how happy they are. They've lifted their house up. We even tried to raise up entire towns, including the ironically named Highlands, New Jersey. Wanted downtown lifted up after Sandy. But we didn't move anything out of the way. And when your only adaptation strategy is to raise a few properties up, that means you still have to hold the shoreline in place in front of them. It's not a long-term solution. So this is what we've been doing since Sandy, everywhere from Delaware to Connecticut. And that is pumping the beaches back in front of those properties that we simply lifted up. This has become our de facto coastal adaptation strategy for the entire United States of America. We are trying to pump sand in front of every piece of investment property in the country. And when the Corps does this, that number is probably low now, 26 million cubic yards of sand. This is for New Jersey. The Corps plans to do this for 50 years in your community when they design a project for you. That means they have to come back every 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years, depending on the community, and do this. Most people don't realize that many of our beaches are entirely an artificial construct now. You go to beaches in northern New Jersey, there's not a natural grain of sand on that beach. It's entirely pumped up there. You go to Miami Beach, go to South Beach, Miami, it's a beach, it's a Disney beach, entirely manufactured. Virginia Beach, Myrtle Beach, all of those places, manufactured beaches, no natural sand. We're trying to do this everywhere. Now the Corps likes to call this restoration, but I disagree. And the other problem with it is that it's temporary. This is Seabright, New Jersey. That's what it looked like before they had their beach, after Sandy. So here's the Seabright, New Jersey, getting their post-Sandy sand. My favorite thing about this picture from Seabright is this. So this is the hotel that I was standing in when I took the previous picture. You see what they have on the wall? They have a picture from 3 years before that when they were getting their last beach. So this is like a year and a half ago, and this is a picture on the wall in that hotel from the same location from 4 years ago. And Sandy made it look like this. So the thing about beach nourishment is that beach nourishment is a forever commitment. If you decide as a community, or if we decide as a nation, to hold beaches in place doing beach nourishment, we're going to be doing it forever. You don't do one project and walk away. Even people in Alabama get this. Politicians don't, or they don't care. So this is Jones Beach, Ocean Parkway. Nice big post-Sandy sand dune that they built. This is what the Corps builds now, by the way, that they call sand dunes. Does that look like a sand dune to you? Really, they're these trapezoidal sand dikes. They're not dunes. Nature would never build something that looks like that. Then here, see that black dirt? This is what I really like about this one. They're actually putting topsoil on the back of this sand dune so they can put sod on it. And this is what the sand dune looked like within a few weeks after they constructed it, because sand dunes actually don't go in the ocean. They're supposed to be far back from the ocean. But the Corps doesn't always understand this. A local national senator, of which Jones Beach, who represents the constituents of Jones Beach, was very unhappy about the fact that the post-Sandy dune disappeared so fast. So the senator said, the feds have invested millions in rebuilding the road. Now they need to create a plan to protect it in the years to come. And the plan would require the Corps to prioritize funding for dredging and sand placement, blah, 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 for the next 50 years. I won't tell you who it is that suggested that we should be maintaining that crazy sand dune for the next 50 years, but his name rhymes with Duck Bloomer. And he's a senator from the state of New York who considers himself to be a progressive when it comes to climate change. Except in his district. But the Army Corps of Engineers thought that keeping that dune there for 50 years makes a lot of sense. it's a fairly good approach to address the problem. And of course, the problem that the Corps is worried about is loss of jobs within the Corps of Engineers. This definitely addresses that problem because they'll be doing it forever. The problem with beach nourishment, from our perspective, is that we have absolutely no idea what the environmental implications are for doing this. So when you do a beach nourishment project, you destroy all of the benthic organisms in the area where you take the sand. We call it the borrow area. So since Hurricane Sandy, the Corps has moved now almost 40 million cubic yards of sand in New Jersey and New York alone. That's like filling a major stadium, football stadium, 15 to 20 times, spread out over the nearshore zone 1 to 3 miles offshore. And then you take that material and you place it on the beach. I'm going to skip that one. You place it on the beach and you bury the intertidal zone, which kills everything in the intertidal zone. All the little crustaceans, worms, organisms that shorebirds might be feeding on. And the Corps says that it's okay, the impacts are not significant. They'll recover. The problem is that that might be true if we just did it once and walked away. But the problem is that the projects the Corps has designed, I'm going to skip to this slide. The projects the Corps has designed for Delaware, they have to come back every 2 years and do it again. For New Jersey, every 3 to 4 years and do it again. It's a classic example of what we call cumulative impacts. Doing things over and over again, so that even small impacts add up over time. Not only that, now we do it everywhere. So you take these small impacts and you do it all over the place, and you do it over and over again, and it becomes a problem for the benthic organisms offshore, and those impacts cascade up into fisheries. For the critters on the beach, and those impacts cascade up into foraging shorebirds, who knows what else. It's supposed to get evaluated through the National Environmental Policy Act, through NEPA. The Corps, by law, is supposed to examine cumulative impacts of projects, but they have never done it for beach nourishment on a programmatic level. And the problem is that we do, in fact, do these projects everywhere. This is just a basic map of where we have beach nourishment projects on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast of the US. And the sad truth is that if you look at this map, what you'll see is that it's hard to find beaches in the US that are not engineered. Since 1923, according to our database, over 2,000 projects. We're talking about billions of cubic yards of sand and extraordinary amounts of money to do this, all to try and hold our shorelines in place. This is it. This is our adaptation policy in the US right now, that we have sort of adopted without any national discussion as to whether this makes sense or not. And we spend significant amounts of federal dollars on these projects. You can look at a heat map of where it's happening the most. New Jersey and Florida are the winners. You can look at federal expenditures, federal tax dollars. It's also troubling that the amount of sand that we're moving is going up through time and the cost is accelerating dramatically. One last little bit. If you just look at what we've done in the Southeast, we put this together for the Southeastern Governors Association. If you just took the beach nourishment projects that have been done in the Southeastern U.S., 425 million cubic yards of sand, you could build one beach going from the Virginia line all the way to Louisiana that would be 600 feet wide, 1,760 miles long, 2 feet thick. That's how much sand we're moving on the coast in the U.S. right now, largely funded with federal dollars. And we have absolutely no plan for how and where to spend that money. We don't have any idea about the environmental impacts, so we can't determine what the negative costs are from these projects. The Army Corps of Engineers and some environmental groups would like to tell you that this is green infrastructure. It's environmentally sound coastal protection, but it's not restoration. When you build giant trapezoidal dunes that are not ecosystems, it's not restoration. And the beaches are designed for storm protection. The berms are too high, the dunes are too high. It's not restoration. It's engineering. Now, having said all of that, let me be clear. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing this anywhere. In fact, that's not my decision. It's policymakers' decision. I am suggesting we probably shouldn't be doing it everywhere, and that we should probably have some sort of a national plan for where it makes sense to spend public dollars and where it doesn't. We should at least have some priorities. Because these beaches would be okay without us. And natural shorelines would be there no matter what. And the problem that we have right now is that we have created, as a nation, this tremendous moral hazard. I was at a meeting in New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy. I was on a team for Rebuild by Design, where federal government tried to come in and get a bunch of architects to come up with creative ideas for how we can build resilient communities. And we had a mayor from a coastal community in New Jersey come in to talk to us. And she said a couple of interesting things. The first thing she said is, when she was characterizing her community, she said, we have the second lowest tax rates in New Jersey, but we want to be number one. While the federal government is pumping up a $250 million beach in front of her town, and we had just spent at least as much rebuilding their infrastructure, their roads, their power grid, and everything else, and they all qualify for federal flood insurance. Well, it's interesting that they can have such low tax rates and live in such a dangerous place. And the reason they can is because federal taxpayers are assuming all of the risk. So people will often say to me, well, gosh, why would these people at the coast rebuild when they've just suffered such tremendous damage and they know how dangerous it is? This lady must be crazy, right? No. Dauphin Island, Alabama is a great example. This is a community that's had 7 presidential disaster declarations in the last 25 years. And the feds have gone in there and rebuilt that community every time. Are they crazy? No, they're making a perfectly logical economic choice. It still is affordable, in fact, beneficial for them to be there. You know who's crazy? You are. We are. Because we are the ones that are assuming all of the risk. for many of these communities. And it's not just through federal flood insurance. It's through Stafford Act rebuilding, where the funds come into the community and rebuild the infrastructure that allows the homes to be there. It's through a variety of other incentives that incentivize people to stay in places that are hazardous rather than to reconsider. I think that we need to have a national conversation about where it makes sense to do this and where it doesn't. I'm not saying that we should abandon any of these places, by the way. I like to go to the beach. I'm happy to stay in an oceanfront beach house when I'm there. If I have to pay a little bit more because that community is internalizing the costs of living in a hazardous area, then that's sort of the way that it should be, I think. From a scientific perspective, I think that the mayor, very nice mayor who came to us to talk to us about New Jersey, would have cared a lot more about the coastal hazards in her community and rising sea level if they had to cover the risk of being there. If they were spending largely their dollars to do the beach nourishment projects and their dollars to rebuild their infrastructure, then they would care a lot about where it makes sense to spend that money and where it doesn't. They would care a lot about the vulnerability footprint of their community. But if the community is bailed out multiple times, then they don't really need to think that hard about natural hazards or the beach nourishment project. So I think what we need in the U.S. today is we as a nation need to have a conversation about where it makes sense to hold the shoreline in place and where it doesn't. Because we can't hold every shoreline in place forever. We just can't. There's not enough sand and there's not going to be enough money. So where are we going to do it? Where are we going to spend federal funds? Where do we want to incentivize development? And where do we want to step back? And understand, I'm not saying we should tell anybody to leave the coast in any particular place. That's, again, not my job. But we do need to understand that since we can't hold everything in place forever, and the way we're doing it right now is incredibly expensive, it's temporary, and it's environmentally damaging, we should at least have a plan for how and where we're going to do it. And that's the best way to preserve these coastal economies for the long run, is to be thoughtful about how we do it. And that's the best way to preserve these ecosystems over the long run. Thanks. Happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
Would you guess that we might run out of sand or money first?
Well, we already are running out of sand. You know, in Florida, South Florida, they're already talking about getting sand from the Bahamas. There are localities in Florida that are already fighting over the limited sand resources are there. Palm Beach County thinks that they have maybe 16, 17, 18 years worth of sand in their nearshore zone that they can have access to. Southern North Carolina, there's a lot of rock offshore. It's not just sand. And finding good beach-compatible sources of sand is difficult in some places. In other places, it won't be a problem for a while. You know, Long Island, for example, is a giant pile of glacial sand. The glaciers left a big present on the Cape, and the glaciers left a big present on Long Island. There's a lot of sand there. You could probably pump sand there for a while. So there it would be more a question of whether you can continue to pay or not. Long Island, the answer is probably yes. But in some places, we are already running out of sand. Yes, sir.
Can you spend a minute or two talking about river dredging and seawall building?
River dredging and seawall building?
Jetties and river dredging.
Well, that's a pretty open-ended question that I could certainly spend more than a minute talking about. I will say that there are a wide variety of perspectives on coastal protection, like building seawalls, riprap, bulkheads, whatever, to protect individual properties. Many states outlaw them altogether. My home state, the state of North Carolina, banned seawalls on the ocean front in the 1980s. You cannot build a seawall in the state of North Carolina to protect anything. We've built one seawall in that entire period of time, and it was to protect an historic site, Fort Fisher. You know, you have to understand that if you are taking an action to shut off erosion or to provide protection in one place, that there will always be downdrift impacts to neighboring properties or other places. So I mean, that's just the way that it works. In California, for example, these days, if you build a seawall, even at the parcel level, you have to pay ordered mitigation because the state of California recognizes that building a seawall shuts off the sand supply that would have been provided to the beach by the erosion along that property. And the property owner has to pay ordered mitigation into the forever, essentially, as long as they hold that permit for that seawall. So anything that we do in the coastal zone has implications for other properties, other people's economic value and economic use, and for whatever part of the beach is the public part of the beach in your state. Same for anything that's going to change the way the sand is moving around on the coast. The sand on the coast is like water in the West. If you interrupt the flow, then you're depriving your neighbor of something. And if one person collects it all, then you have less downstream. So it really is analogous, and many states have codified that. Specifically in regulation, they speak about the sand sharing system, and there are prohibitions on interrupting the sand sharing system because of this understanding that if you're doing something that may benefit your property, it can cause economic harm to somebody else's. Yes, sir.
As far as policy, is there any difference in the way publicly owned beachfront, shorefront is treated versus shorefront in front of investment, commercial, residential?
By the federal government, you mean? So there are two main things that the federal government will ask if they come into your community to fund a beach nourishment project, a coastal protection project. They will ask private property owners to turn over, these days, perpetual easements to whatever portion of that ocean front that private property owner may own. And if it's a town, the town will have to provide that same guarantee to the federal government. And typically it's the towns that gather these easements and turn it over. The second thing is that you do have to guarantee a certain level of public beach access. So an entirely gated community, theoretically, is not supposed to receive federal funds for a beach nourishment project. But you can have a community that is just all private homes, as long as there is the appropriate amount of beach access for the general public, can still receive a federal beach nourishment project. It's not just for public properties. Yes, ma'am.
It sounds as if the federal flood insurance really just rewards and protects people who are taking risks living along the coast. Those risks really should belong to those people who choose to live there. How can we transfer those risks to the people who live along the coast, rather than the rest of us paying.
So to be clear, federal flood insurance also has significant liabilities inland as well. The federal flood insurance program insures people nationwide. It was designed to insure properties in the floodplains of Mississippi and places like that, where there are farming communities. In addition, the federal flood insurance program only insures properties up to a value of about $250,000, which for some oceanfront properties is not a lot. Most of the people who live in the Hamptons, Bridgehampton, Sagaponic, they don't have federal flood insurance. Those are $22 million homes. There's just no reason for them to have it. I think that there are problems with the federal flood insurance program in that it is still insuring investment properties and not just primary residences. But the bigger problem to me in providing the wrong incentives for how we approach development at the coast comes with a $60 billion relief bill under the Sandy Relief Act that puts tremendous amounts of infrastructure back in communities that allows those homes to still exist in dangerous locations. And then when we give the Corps of Engineers $4.8 billion to build beaches in front of New York and New Jersey, those are significant community-wide incentives for maintaining properties in dangerous locations. I mean, the federal flood insurance program creates a moral hazard in places beyond just the coast, even in floodplains. But to me, it's not the primary problem. Yes, sir.
People live within 5 feet of sea level today in the United States, and how many billions of dollars worth of property is at risk in the current scenario after 2100? And what are the plans to do anything about those risks? For example, Boston is talking about building a dam through Boston Harbor at the cost of tens of billions of dollars. What does a community like Newburyport do when sea level goes up 3 feet at the end of 2100 and there's no way to have a viable community here? I mean, what are the approaches to that? And then people have talked about that the property values at the coast, if they all become zero, what happens to the nation's infrastructure banks which are owed a lot of this money? What kind of a plan is
So to be clear, these beach nourishment projects are primarily benefiting simply the rows of homes along the immediate ocean front. Statistical analysis of the benefits of beach nourishment projects before and after storms, when we're talking about these kinds of federal expenditures, we are talking about the primary beneficiaries are that one row right along the ocean front. And that's what I'm talking about right now.
The primary beneficiary, but there are also millions of houses behind those, and then there are communities behind those that are all, to one extent or another, benefiting from the buffer that's put up.
No, they're really not benefiting from the buffer that's put up there. Only the oceanfront homes are benefiting from that buffer. If we went through there and ripped that row of oceanfront homes down, you'd have a beach back, and they would have their local amenity, and that erosion is not happening at a rate that it's an existential threat to the entire coastal economy. It is primarily an existential threat to certain erosion hotspots and certain oceanfront homes. And the money that we're spending doing beach nourishment, the Corps of Engineers has to do a very detailed economic analysis of what the benefits are from their projects, and they never include any of those other places you've mentioned.
I agree with that. So that in New Jersey, before Sandy struck, all of the very wealthy communities had beach nourishment, and all the poor housing did not. And the results were that most of the communities that were hurt, the poorer communities and the rich communities, were protected.
So the other thing that's problematic, as you say, about the way that we decide to fund beach nourishment projects with federal dollars is you have to have a certain amount of property value to protect, because the costs of the projects have gotten so astronomical that if you have, you know, a community that has primarily 1,500 square foot single-family homes, you're probably not going to qualify for the federal contribution because your economic value is not going to be high enough. So it actually encourages people to increase the density and cost of development on their ocean front so that they can meet the benefit cost analysis for a core project. And that's you know, another thing that's problematic about the way we do the funding. And to me, this is all, again, a symptom of this greater disease, which is that we really have no national vision for what parts of the coast we want to protect, what parts of the coast it's in the national interest to protect, and for those communities that we're not going to be able to protect, how can we help them deal with the changes that are going to be occurring over the next few decades? And I'm an optimist, not a pessimist, by the way. I don't think that you're all going to be running away from the coast, you know, during your lifetime. But I do think that if you want to preserve the continuity of your community and spend your money wisely, then we shouldn't be wasting our money on futile efforts in places where we have to protect over and over and over again. So you need to identify those places that you can preserve over the long run, and we need to figure out a way to walk away from those areas that's going to just cost a tremendous amount of money with very little return.
I was wondering, the New York Times had a piece right after the election talking about the coastal development, the bubble bursting for people buying coastal areas. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts were on that. Do you think that's going to happen?
Don't really see it happening. You know, if you go back to the Jersey Shore right now, in communities like Maniloking that were just wiped out, all the properties are back and they've all been sold. The real estate market at the coast is still doing pretty well, and it's doing especially well in places where the federal government is essentially propping up the market. You know, this is a case, I think, where if we really allowed market forces to work at the coast, we would get better results. One of the reasons why oceanfront properties are so valuable in so many places is because there are all of these costs that the home doesn't have to internalize. Let me go back to Dauphin Island, Alabama. So you own a beach house on Dauphin Island, Alabama. 7 times in the last 25 years, the federal government has come in and put the roads back, put the power grid back, even pumped sand from the backside of the island around to the front so you could replat the lots after Hurricane Katrina on Dauphin Island, Alabama. 7 times. Now, imagine if Dauphin Island, Alabama were a private gated community and the people had to pay homeowners association dues to cover all of that. They'd be paying $100,000 a year, $150,000 a year, something like that. These are homes that are $500,000 homes, $800,000 homes. They couldn't do it. Or the homes would be worth $5,000. This is the problem. But the homes there, the value of those homes has still continued to increase through time, even though the costs of keeping them there have gone up. You know, I think this is the basic problem. The market is not internalizing the risk into the cost of those properties because somebody else is paying for the risk. Yes, sir?
Thank you very much for a very provocative presentation. It causes one to want to take action, and I'm curious about your recommendations as to how to do that. To whom does one right or with what policymakers will engage to address some of these questions? Is this all at the congressional level, or is there a particular agency that should be focused on?
Well, so I have, sadly, at the federal level, while I have spoken with both senators and members of Congress about these issues, and most of them absolutely agree with just about everything that I have said today, our federal government and legislative branch in particular has been so absolutely dysfunctional for so long that there's just no legislation coming out of Congress anymore. The idea that they could come together around a national plan for how we manage our coasts to me seems like pie in the sky thinking at the moment. So my suggestion is that you focus your thoughts a little bit more locally than that. And there are many communities in Massachusetts that are facing similar dilemmas that yours is. And this balance between coastal protection and protecting private property and preserving a beach that everybody wants to be able to go to and not doing harm to neighbors. These are questions that many communities are grappling with. We're working with a group on Nantucket right now and have been for a couple of years, but some very similar questions. And many states have sort of a coastal organization that serves to bring these various interests together, and I don't think that you guys really have anything like that. South Carolina has the South Carolina Coastal Conservation League. North Carolina has the North Carolina Coastal Federation, specifically focusing exactly on these types of issues at the state level and bringing communities together to talk about them. You need something like that. And then you need people at the state level to actually enforce any regulations you have on the books. Because, yeah. Yes, ma'am?
How much of the coastal issue is linked to the global warming?
That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked that. The question was how much of the coastal issue is really directly linked to global warming? And my answer to that is that, in fact, I don't even think we really need to talk about sea level rise yet when we're talking about changing the way we manage our coasts in America. Because right now, we're not doing a good job of managing for storms. So when Hurricane Katrina hits and shows us exactly where everything's vulnerable, and then we put everything right back there, we haven't learned the storm hazard lesson yet. So there's no point in me walking into a coastal community or the State House or going up into Capitol Hill and saying, hey, let's plan for 1 meter of sea level rise. Because we're not doing a good job of planning for hurricanes, nor'easters, tropical storms, and king tides. And the first step in planning for climate change and rising sea level is to do a very good job of planning for the coastal hazards we know exist right now. So what I like about that is it sort of takes the hot button issue off the table, and you can still feel good about that. So, I don't think we need to talk about climate change. We just need to talk about the existing coastal hazards that we know about right now and doing a good job of not rebuilding in the areas that are of known vulnerability. And the only thing so what I end up at the end when I'm talking to policymakers about sea level rise is I say, I'll tell you this, here's the thing you need to remember about sea level rise. It tells you that every single coastal erosion problem or every single coastal issue that you have right now is not going to get better. It's just going to get worse. So take the issues you have right now, let's focus on dealing with them, and sea level rise tells you they're not going to resolve themselves. You're not going to have long-term erosion trends all of a sudden reverse overnight, and then you'll have 100 years of accretion. It's not going to. So the only question about sea level rise is how fast it will get worse, but nothing's going to get better.
For that
great presentation. And just in terms of, who do you talk to about, some of these changes? I mean, certainly the local level is a great place to start. You've got city councilors, planning departments, and people who run your town, and they shape some of the laws and policies that are going on. And so if you're concerned about your repetitive losses and the costs that the town's incurring relative to increases in police and fire and other emergency personnel dealing with repetitive emergencies in the same places all the time, then that's a point that needs to be heard by your local community. And then eventually, hopefully, things will start working more towards the state level and the federal level.